Welcome, everybody. It's a beautiful evening on the Mendocino Coast. Glad you could join us for another talk. We're super excited about this one. Super excited about our speaker. Somebody we've wanted to get on this program for quite some time, and we're really happy to have John join us today. But before I get to that, I want to introduce myself. I'm Sheila Siemens. I'm the director of the Noyo Center for Marine Science. We're a nonprofit on the Mendocino Coast. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, I recognize most of your names, so I know you probably are. I think in my experience with working at the Noyo Center and working on issues in the state, anytime there is a significant issue around whales, John's name comes up. John Kalbakides, our speaker, so we're super excited to have him. He is a founder and senior researcher at the Cascadia Research Collective up in Washington, but John can be found along the entire West Coast and in the Pacific, studying whales and other marine mammals. There's many things we would like to hear John talk about, but tonight he's here to talk about gray whales, which is really great because we have been seeing an unusual mortality event with gray whales, and we would really love to get John's perspective on what's going on out there. It'd be great. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John and have John walk us through the world of gray whales.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate the invite and chance to talk to all of you. I was going to say how much I enjoy as I operate up and down the coast, going out typically for doing some of our humpback and blue whale research up and down the coast. Fort Bragg is usually one of my favorite spots to go out of. It's kind of has a unique character there, and really enjoy it. I got my start doing field efforts with large whales and working out of Bodega Bay, so just a little bit to the south of you, in the mid-1980s. So even though probably most of my research focuses on humpback and blue whales, I'm going to focus tonight on gray whales, and that is a species that I've been studying for quite a while. And I love the story of gray whales because I know many scientists, and certainly myself included, had one sort of view of gray whales, and they were these, maybe let's call them, primitive, highly specialized bottom feeders with a fairly, narrow set of tricks for feeding and specializing in feeding on the bottom on a limited number of prey in the Arctic with a fairly regimented migration. And boy, do I feel like that impression was wrong. And part of what I want to talk about tonight is some of the different research elements we have going on with different aspects of the gray whale population and some of the insights we've been learning about them and how much more of a complex, adaptable, and varied species they are. I list some of the other researchers here that work with me at Cascadia and some of our collaborators, but over the years we've worked a lot. And as I talk about the different groups of gray whales we study, I'll bring in some of the other people that and organizations that we work with and rely on for that. As most of you know, just as a general introduction, gray whales do make this long migration, and at least the eastern North Pacific population of gray whales generally migrates from breeding areas. If you can see my cursor down here in the lower right in Baja, Mexico, migrating along the coast up to their primary feeding areas up in the Arctic. But I'm going to be talking about some other groups of gray whales in addition to the ones that do that. I'm going to be talking about a group that we call the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, and I might call it PCFG for short. I didn't come up with that acronym. It's not a particularly good one, so we have to come up with a new one. I'm also going to talk about a smaller group of gray whales that we've named the Sounders, a much better name and one we came up with ourselves because they come into Puget Sound, and we've studied these individuals for many years, and then they generally continue their migration north, whereas the PCFG whales generally stay and continue to feed in the Pacific Northwest, stretching down to sometimes below Fort Bragg, but generally going from Eureka north up to Southeast Alaska. So these groups, just to cover them one more time, and I'll be talking about them sort of somewhat separately. The overall Eastern North Pacific population, this is a large population, and I'll be focusing quite a bit on the unusual mortality event that's been going on with this group and just was declared over in the last week or two, with an official end in, I think, November 2023, but it just came out recently. And that's the largest population, used to number in the mid 20,000s, now all the way down to the mid 10,000s. That Sounders group of gray whales, which is a group that breaks off from this larger North Pacific group and feeds for a while in spring before continuing north. The Pacific Coast Feeding Group that we treat as a somewhat distinct group because it largely does not migrate to the Arctic. And there's some genetic differences and other reasons to, I think, treat this group as a distinct group. And then finally, there is a group of gray whales that seems to be partially a remnant of a larger Western North Pacific gray whale population. Currently largely feeds off Sakhalin Island in Russia, numbers in the just, 1 to 200 neighborhood. But their status has gotten thrown into a little bit of confusion with some of the recent, I say recent, but you have to be aware, when I say recent, it might mean, 10, 15 years. Findings that a lot of these animals come and breed in the Eastern North Pacific as well. So anyway, starting to go through some of that, let's start with this unusual mortality event that's occurred, because that's what's been in the news quite a bit. This is a UME, or unusual mortality event, is declared by NOAA. There's a committee, I've served on it, of veterinarians and pathologists and biologists like myself that review stranding information and help NOAA and advise NOAA in deciding when to declare strandings as being at a level that is unusual and declares further, deserves further scrutiny and study. And that's the most important thing the UME does, is it kind of focuses efforts by researchers, creates, sometimes investigation of them in much more detail than would otherwise occur. Here, and these two charts I've taken right off the NOAA website because they combine data from all along the range of the gray whale. And it shows, first in this chart, you can see that, there's a certain level of expected mortality with a population that is so coastal and numbers in the 10 to 20s thousands. And then you can see this strong uptick that occurred in 2019. And that's what resulted in the unusual mortality event being declared in 2019. And since then, it's steadily declined. And you can see how in 2023, it's almost back to those normal, average levels. So that's why the UME designation was lifted. That mortality event covered the whole range of gray whales. This map on the right are the stranding locations for where gray whales were documented washing up dead during this period, this UME period. And you can see they stretched from the breeding areas all along their migratory route, all the way up into the northern Bering Sea. So it covered the whole range of gray whales. This is a table breaking down the number. The highest number was in 2019 with 216 documented. And you have to keep in mind, and I'll show you why this is the case, that this number of documented deaths is a small fraction of the true numbers. And some of the population numbers revealed how much of an underrepresentation it is. And that's been known for some time. It's probably on the order of 10% or possibly even less of the mortality gets documented in this way, but it's still added up to hundreds of animals spread along their range. Now, I'm fortunate in that a paper just came out in Science, the journal Science, and it came out late in 2023 with Josh Stewart as the senior author. And it described a long-term model and summarized much of the data on the eastern North Pacific gray whales and how these stranding events fit into that. And again, this was somewhat surprising to researchers when they actually plotted, and on this chart, you actually see these points and bars represent the estimated gray whale population based on counts done by Southwest Fisheries Science Center. And then you see a black line and a grayed area, and that's their model results of what they think the population has been doing. And gray whales have a long recovery they've made from being depleted. Gray whales are one of the species that was hunted in multiple eras of whaling. They were the targets of macaw whaling historically. They were part of the hunt in what was called the Yankee whaling, or early commercial whaling era, and they were targeted again in what's sometimes referred to as the modern era of commercial whaling. And that included whaling stations operating out of areas all along the West Coast. There was a whaling station that continued to take gray whales into the late 1960s, operating out of San Francisco Bay. So this population has gone through a long history of exploitation. The exciting thing about this paper that I'm showing you here is that it linked these changes in gray whale population. It brought in the data on births. It showed that there were periods where this population died. It estimated the true number of deaths, and you can actually see the model now predicted that in some of these peak periods, there were thousands of whales, dying and causing these major, what they termed boom bust cycles in gray whale populations. And a lot of that tracked with some of the data on body condition being measured in gray whales. And I'll zero in on this in a second on one of those figures. But some of the considerations in thinking about this unusual mortality event is that the gray whale population over the last 30 years has been at pretty high levels, and immediately prior to this 2019 unusual mortality event, the abundance estimates reached their highest estimates at 27,000. So the population overall had been doing pretty well and was at least in post-whaling days at record levels. One of the things that's concerned scientists is the main area that gray whales feed in the Arctic is an area that's undergone fairly dramatic changes, due to climate change, dramatic decreases in ice overall. So that's been a concern of how that's affecting gray whales. And I'll just point out that both in this paper, and in previous studies, the relationship between ice cover and gray whales is a complicated one, in that in some of the research, it's actually been found that when ice cover is lower, it allows gray whales to expand the areas they can access and get to and feed. And there was a correlation between when there was low ice in the Arctic, that there would actually be a higher number of gray whale births in the following year. So there were some ways that lower ice, at least in the very short term, benefited gray whales. But there are other signs, main gray whale feeding areas that have seen a dramatic decline in prey abundance that more seem to reflect that as those ice conditions have changed, they've also changed and had impacts on some of the food supply for gray whales as well. One of the encouraging things is that gray whales did go through another unusual mortality event that was also very similar to the recent one in 1999-2000. And they completely bounced back from that before this most recent unusual mortality event. Okay, I'm going to go on, and now I'm going to zero in a little bit on the long-term data set we have for Washington State on gray whale strandings. And I partly go to this because in Washington State, we've been fairly fortunate of having a long, 50-year history of responding to strandings by various groups. They haven't quite been as affected by funding levels and other changes. So we're actually able to look at this long-term change in gray whale strandings. And I think it's one of the better records for any spot on the coast on the number of gray whale strandings. And you can see for Washington, our number of gray whale strandings by year, this goes from 1977, in this case through 2022. I haven't shown the 2023 tally on here, but you can see it generally averaged around 5 whales or so in most years. But there were peak periods, and in particular, I'll just highlight 3 periods here that I'm going to also come back to. And here's our recent unusual mortality event. So it's very obvious and in the stranding record for Washington State alone. Earlier, I showed you the kind of combined strandings on the entire range, but we also see that same kind of dramatic increase in 2019 and then above normal levels since then, but down some and approaching normal. You'll also see here's that other unusual mortality event I talked about in 1999, 2000. And I'll also briefly highlight that the next highest pair of years is in 1990, 91. And I'm going to come back to these 3 time periods at a number of places in this talk. I will mention that, you know, most of the gray whale stranding in these large unusual mortality events, many of them were thin or emaciated, you know, both the whales that washed up dead, you know, or even some of the ones that we saw in very debilitated condition still alive. And sometimes that can be hard to detect in gray whales because they have a blubber layer that actually stays present and visible even when they're pretty thin and emaciated. Just a lot of the oil and lipids, you know, are drawn out of that blubber layer, but they will still have a blubber layer, just very little oil or fat in it. And their whole body will become very thin and angular like you see in this photo. But that quickly disappears as soon as the animals have been dead any length of time due to bloating. And then this appearance is no longer obvious. But we're still able to test things like the lipid levels and see how, you know, basically emaciated some of these animals are. Now, during these UME years, it doesn't mean all the animals died just from starvation. We also saw increased levels of things like entanglement, ship strikes, and we've even seen a recent uptick in animals that had been attacked by killer whales live stranding. And we think some of those things are related. You know, as gray whales became debilitated and searched for new areas to feed, it would often bring them into areas where they would have greater interactions with fishing activities, you know, or be vulnerable to ship strikes. So sometimes, you know, tracing out exactly what's killing these gray whales in these UME years can be tricky. And so many of the whales, when they wash up, are in you know, decomposed condition. It's logistically and otherwise challenging to get really detailed tests done. So I'll just point out that we have a pretty good idea that most of these gray whales died due to being debilitated due to poor nutritional condition, but there's still uncertainty in some of that.
Hey, John, can I ask a quick question on that last
Yes.
slide before you move on? Because it's something I've wanted to know for quite some time. So the upper picture with all that, the intense amount of lice on that animal, does that indicate a poor nutrition, or is that okay to have that level of lice on that animal?
Yes. No, and I think that's a really good question. And I will say that especially, you know, whale lice infestations or even higher levels of barnacles on whales, you know, can be a sign of poor condition and health, even though healthy gray whales still support some levels of those. So it's normal to have some level of that. But you definitely do see intensified levels of those in some animals. I don't know if that's because they're swimming slower or their skin is sloughing more when they're in bad body condition, but there is a relationship between you know, animals sometimes in poor condition and much higher infestations of things like whale lice.
Okay, that's great. And before you move on, since I've broken in here, we have a question about the lipid level. So what's the typical lipid level for a whale that is alive? Like, what is a healthy whale?
Yes, and it's actually a hard thing for us to measure. We have measured it in like biopsy samples taken from live healthy whales, but even there, you're not getting a totally representative picture. And also, I'll point out that a lot of these gray whale strandings are occurring in spring, which is right at the tail end of their seasonal fast. So even a healthy gray whale would be expected to be thinner and have lower level of lipids at that time of year. So it's all kind of complicating factors that make it a little bit trickier, to interpret this. But certainly in a lot of the healthier animals, we've seen, lipid levels that are certainly above 50%. And in some of these stranded animals, we were getting lipid levels down under 5%.
Wow.
So sometimes it's pretty dramatic, but there are some other factors affecting that make that a little tricky. And decomposed animals also, it can affect the lipid levels. So I'm kind of glossing over a little bit of a trickier question, but we definitely can see these animals are emaciated and have lower than we would expect lipid levels. The highest lipid levels we see are animals that are either ship struck, suffer some kind of traumatic injury, especially in fall, which is the period that'd be healthier. And that's where we've gotten sometimes lipid levels up in the 80, 90%.
Wow. Okay, great. Thanks so much, John.
I mentioned killer whales, just some examples of gray whales that had been attacked by killer whales. We all know that gray whale calves are often vulnerable to killer whale attacks, but in some of these cases, these were not animals larger than calves that also are occasionally attacked by killer whales. In these strandings that we've been seeing, it covers a range of whale sizes. So, some of these are animals in this, and these are all in centimeters. So, these are whales getting up to about 10 meters or, 25 to 30 feet is kind of one peak we have. A lot of those animals seem to be yearlings. But then we do see a fair number of adult animals, as well that exist. And especially in the adult animals, this struck us as interesting. You see, in not the largest bin, preponderance of males over females, but then when you get to the largest size, females outnumber males, and that's partly because in baleen whales, the females tend to be larger. Okay, I think I'm going to skip this. I covered some of these points already, so let me just jump over that. I will mention a few other things about whale strandings. We do try to conduct detailed exams, and some of the unusual things we sometimes find in these exams, like some of these gray whales that have come into Puget Sound and fed in areas of high human activities. These are some of the things we found in the stomach contents of a gray whale that fed near Seattle and Puget Sound, and we ended up, finding, all of these items in the stomach contents. And it just shows you gray whales, by feeding on the bottom and sucking up what's on the bottom and then filtering it through that baleen. It's a very effective feeding mechanism, but you also end up ingesting a lot of things like this. And in that tarp there, are sweatpants, towels, lots of plastic bags, a golf ball, juice containers. There was a wide variety of these types of objects, in the stomach. We don't think it actually killed this whale or played a role in its death, but I kind of viewed it as a little bit of maybe a visible sign of what some of these whales, if they feed in contaminated areas, are probably getting exposed to. That includes the kind of objects you can't see, contaminants that are concentrated in the sediment. We do engage in working with live whales, especially entangled large whales. And two of us here, Kirsten Flynn and I, are both level 4 entanglement responders. So this was a gray whale we freed from Dungeness crab gear in the Strait of Juan de Fuca a few years ago. I am excited, and was mentioning this prior to my talk. Cascadia is kind of trying to build support for something we're calling Partnership for West Coast Whale Entanglement Action. Doug Sandilands and Jen Tackaberry, two level 5 entanglement responders that used to work in the Pacific Northwest, are coming back to Cascadia to help lead that. And we hope to try to spur more concerted efforts to both document entanglements, but also, help in freeing whales from that. We get involved in other types of rescues. This was a juvenile gray whale that stranded. Usually when whales strand, they strand dead, but we've had a few cases where they've stranded live. And this was one that we were able to successfully rescue and refloat from a number of years ago. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Sounders gray whales. And you'll see I'm going to come back to a couple of points I already made. But the Sounders gray whales are a small group of gray whales we started to document in 1990, feeding in Puget Sound here in Washington State. And some of the whales were very distinctly marked. This was a whale we called Patch. I just can't think right now why we gave it that name, but anyway, this whale was one of the more distinctive whales we tracked for more than 30 years. These whales have a very high risk feeding strategy they engage in. They've discovered highly productive, dense ghost shrimp aggregations that occur in some areas of Puget Sound in the intertidal zone. So these whales at high tide, and we have pretty big tides in Puget Sound, will swim into the shallows at high tide. And even then, they may be only in 8-10 feet of water. So there'll be parts of their body sticking above the water as they try to work into these shallows. And they'll feed on these ghost shrimp beds. And at low tide, when the water's out, and this is an aerial photograph of a ghost shrimp bed, each of these pits is something like that. These depressions that have pooled water is a pit made by a feeding gray whale. And each of these pits is about 10 feet long and 4 feet wide. And they're visible at larger low tides where this area is completely high and dry. And this seems to be one of the main strategies gray whales in this region are using to feed. And they'll do that intensely. You can actually find these pits on Google Earth. These are actual Google Earth images where we've accessed some of the past photographs. And these little lines of depressions you see on this map are feeding pits of gray whales just blown up on Google Earth, where we find images of the areas where the gray whales are feeding. And this map here from Google Earth, this is actually a series of white dots that we've marked on this map where we documented feeding pits, and something on the order of 20,000 feeding pits we could document on Google Earth. And we found out that the number of these increased, especially in recent years, and I'll show you why. Now, because these gray whales can only access this area at high tide, we're actually able to look at their feeding in relation to the tidal cycle. So here's your tidal cycle down here. These little areas, this is a measure of the roll of the whale. And these kind of red raised areas here are the whale rolling 90 degrees on its right side to feed. And you can see it's engaging in this feeding right around the time of high tide, maybe slightly skewed towards the rising tide, and able to feed for only a portion of the time during those high tides. And when it's feeding, this is the depth to which it's not diving here on this chart, and it's only diving to a couple of meters depth. So it's feeding very shallow. And I'll show you some of the evidence of that. I think I'll skip this slide because I'll cover some of this in what I'm going to talk about. When you look at these Sounders gray whales, this is a figure, and every row on this figure is a different one of our known identified Sounder gray whales, along with its number, the name we've given it, the sex where we know it, and then along across the top of this chart are years going from 1990 to 2023. And where this area is shaded, that means we saw that whale that year. And the main thing I want you to get from this is there's some of these whales, like you can take Shackleton or Earhart, which are our two pioneering whales seen in the very first year, 1990. And you can see they are seen most years. And some of the years where they're not seen, where there's no color in the box, in some cases, especially these early years, we didn't have a lot of effort, so we might have just missed them. So these whales come back on a really regular basis. And there were 6 of them that seemed to have discovered, there were 2 that showed up in 1990. They were joined by another 4 in 1991, and those whales kept returning. And then you see here in 1999, 2000, they were joined by another 6 whales. And then you'll see here another 8 whales joined them in around 2018, 19, and 20. Now, you may be recalling something about those years. Maybe I'm going to go ahead just for a second and go to this figure. And when I showed you this chart of the strandings in Washington, we focused on 3 periods where there were higher numbers of strandings of gray whales. And they were 1990, 91, 99, 2000, and then starting in 2019. And these are exactly the periods that new sounders came and started feeding in this area. In fact, if you take this chart here and superimpose it with the number of new sounders joining, which are these gray, slightly fainter gray bars, you'll see how they line up exactly with these periods of high mortality. So it sort of answers the question, why would gray whales make this deviation off their migratory pathway to try to find and discover this high-risk feeding strategy? And the answer is desperation, because these were periods that gray whales were facing major nutritional stress. And now I've taken that same stranding graph that I showed you earlier, and this time superimposed it with that graph of what the overall gray whale population was doing based on that model published in the Stewart et al. Science paper. And you'll again see that there are 3 main periods of dramatic declines in the estimated gray whale population, and those also line up with these same periods when there were higher levels of strandings and when gray whales were seeking alternate areas to feed. Okay, I'm going to skip this. We have been tracking the body condition of these gray whales, working with John Durbin and Holly Firmbaugh, who do these high resolution vertical photographs of whales with drones to look at their body condition. And we're able to see some dramatic changes that these whales go through when these sounders gray whales, when they come. And for example, here you see the sounders often arrive in February or March. And this is the same whale in these 2 photographs here. And you'll just see how much girthier it's become from February to April, feeding on these ghost shrimp beds. And we can plot that. This is plots of individual whales and how their body condition has improved, plotted by Julian Day through the spring period when the gray whales are there. Okay, I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit because I notice it's 6:40 and I've got a ways to go. So you'll notice I'll be jumping over a few slides here. Again, some of the kind of different body conditions of different whales that we get. We did notice one thing that was surprising to us is that for some whales, these 2 whales on the right, we noticed that their girthiest part was further back on their body in some years compared to this whale that's a male. These were both females. And we realized that this was an indication these 2 whales in those years were pregnant. And that was a little bit surprising that we could detect that, because that's pretty early in the kind of gestation of gray whales. So these high resolution photographs are valuable not just to look at body condition, but they're also useful for looking at this pregnancy status for gray whales. Again, I might jump over a few. We've had great success working with John and Holly on this project. Measuring body condition. We also do this with some of the photographs we take from the boat to document how they return. Now, I want to show you a few of the kind of more exciting things starting in 2015 and 16, and then continuing into recent years. We've been starting to deploy these small suction cup attached tags to some of these sounders, gray whales, to more precisely document some of their behavior, like that earlier plot I showed you of the gray whale feeding at high tide and how deep it was feeding and rolling. This all was data coming off these small suction cup attached tags. And we generally would attach these approaching the whale with a boat. And this is one of our small boats. You see someone here with this is actually a low power children's crossbow that we use to fire a small dart that bounces off the whale and collects a small bit of skin. And we use a very low power crossbow because we do this at close range. And then here's, I think this is Dave Cade in this case with Stanford. The camera's on my head as we approach a gray whale and try to deploy one of these suction cup attached tags on it. So we'll usually just try to come in slowly behind the whale, try to get our timing right to then accelerate when we see it surfacing. So in this case, we're getting into position, and now I can see we're probably close enough to be able to reach it if I accelerate when I see it surface next. So we're trying to get this timing right, and here it is coming to the surface. So we'll accelerate slightly and attach the tag and collect the biopsy sample. So that's how we used to deploy these tags. And it was fairly successful. We had done 11 deployments. We had done, I think, about 15 deployments up to 2023 this way. But then in 2023, we started working with Ocean Alliance. And Ocean Alliance had they're the group that they like to call it the snot bot. They do a lot of drone stuff over whales. And so we approached them and we decided to deploy tags from one of their drones, something they'd been trying to develop with other species. And working with them, we did the first deployments of tags from drones on gray whales that had been done. And we did that last April. And, and this is footage from the drone hovering over the whale in this case. And now you'll see the tag just drops and lands on the whale and sticks on the whale. And with that technique, we were able to actually be much more successful and, have kind of less of an impact on the whales by doing that. One of the exciting things about that is it let us do some things we couldn't do before. For example, all three of these whales in this photograph on the left now have a deployed tag on them. When we did our pole deployments from small boats, we wouldn't have been able to approach a group like that multiple times to deploy a tag on each different whale, but that was feasible. We only had one whale show much of a reaction to the drone approach. And so it was an easier way to approach the whales, easier for us and easier on the whales. So we were excited. We're going to be doing that again this coming April. Okay. I was going to show you a little bit of the video that we get from these tags. The tags mostly go on so that we get all sorts of sensor data, and they're actually all these different sensors, and then these are being plotted here. But you'll also see that we can get a short amount of video. We were surprised when we started putting these tags on how much body contact there was between these whales. So this was the first tag we deployed in 2015, and we put it on beautifully facing forward. And within 5 minutes, another whale came up and made contact with this whale, and it turned the tag all the way around to face backwards. So now this tag is facing backwards. It turned out to be interesting because this was one of our pioneering animals, Earhart, and it caught her as she was kind of swimming into the shallows to start feeding. And we began to see how the social interactions between these whales have probably really benefited these whales in how to discover this is a very productive feeding area. And in this case here, as she swam into the shallows, she ends up with 3 other whales. And you'll see one close here, but you're going to see 2 other whales up here, over here on the left side of the screen, follow her in to the shallows, almost like they were taking their cues from her as to when to swim into the shallows and where to go to feed. So we think there's a little bit of kind of social promoting that the way these whales socialize and spend time with each other then benefits some of the other whales. Now, this body contact between whales sometimes caused the tag to turn the wrong way, but other times it helped us out. Like this is another tag we deployed a little bit later. And you can see the tag is sort of not very stable on the whale. You can see it's shaking. It's probably hanging on by only one cup. And in this case, here's two other whales just rubbing up against this whale. They don't make any contact with the tag on that pass, but in a second, you'll see they end up approaching on this next pass and make contact with the tag. And in this case, the tag was facing backwards, but right there, that whale ends up not only turning the tag perfectly facing forward, but also now much more stable and attached. We ended up with what was a record deployment of 67 hours from one of these suction cup tags, partly because it looked like the whales kept pressing it back on through some of these social interactions. We did have at least one case where it also broke the tag, but in other cases it worked out well. Now, the tag sensor data was key. I sort of showed you some aggregate data, but now I'm going to blow up part of the dive record of the whale. I'm just going to show you a few of the things you get off these tags. This first top line is the depth that the whale's diving to. And this is a little period of about 10 minutes in this case here that we're seeing where we've blown up the record. And you can see these numbers in depth are in meters. So this whale is only diving to about 2 meters of water depth, really shallow, 6-7 feet. Then this is a measure from the accelerometer called jerk that measures kind of rapid changes in accelerometry. And you can see there's a series of these peaks that occur that line up now on this next bar down in red. You see these series of plateaus, and that's the roll sensor showing when the whale is angled 90 degrees on its side. And at the start of each of these rolls is a little jerk signal that represents where the whale is actually making contact with the bottom. So anyway, there are a lot of interesting things that we can get off those sensors. And the actual footage of the whale feeding, which is what this is, it happens very fast. It dives there, and here's the bottom right here because it's just in shallow water. And there's that little plume of mud where it makes contact with the bottom and creates that jerk signal. These holes are the openings for ghost shrimp, which is what the whale's feeding on. These are real dense ghost shrimp beds. And this whale will now hold position and will start doing an in and out suction feeding that will allow it to filter out this mud slurry. Now you can see this slurry of mud going by, and actually a little ghost shrimp went by there. So that's how they feed, in this area. And it represents one of the unique cases we know of with any baleen whale that we can actually monitor how much they're feeding, and by looking at what is removed out of the feeding pit, document how much they've eaten or fed. And a PhD student at Stanford, Hannah Clayton, is working with us this year, doing, calorimetry, bomb telemetry. God, I think I'm saying that wrong. Sorry. Calorimeter measurements on the ghost shrimp to get their actual nutritional content and measure the prey. And this is something that was originally done by a graduate student at the University of Washington named Lori Whitecamp, who published one of the first papers on what the gray whales were feeding on. And one of the things she documented was that these prey densities, the grams per meter squared of prey in these ghost shrimp areas, first of all, they were, sorry, it moved off of that. They were much greater outside the pit than they were inside the pit, reflecting that the gray whale had successfully filtered out and removed some of the prey, and that these prey densities were dramatically higher than some of the prey densities reported up in other areas that gray whales feed. So even though they can only access this area some of the time, it's a very productive feeding area. Okay, I think I'm going to jump over some of this. I'm going to move on a little bit to talk about the PCFG gray whales. But maybe I'll just ask, are there any questions right here that are worth answering before I move off the sounders.
Well, you had one question, we had one question from a slide long ago that had to do with some NOAA statistics you showed about the Eastern North Pacific numbers. And
Yes.
so Sari was asking, how come the stats reflect approximately 20,500 versus 27,000 with a decline of to approximately 14,000, or quote, a 30% decline? Why are those numbers different, I think is what she's asking.
Yeah, and some of the difference might be what I was showing, and some of the differences are the estimated abundances themselves. So in some cases, they're the actual counts. And then the model tried to integrate all the different data sets and came up with a modeled population and a drop that, the actual estimates had error bars around them. So there was uncertainty what the actual number was. The gray whale counts, they count gray whales as they go by, but then they have to apply all these correction factors or animals traveling at night, animals traveling further offshore that they can see, animals that went by before or after they did their monitoring. So there's a bunch of uncertainties around that, and that creates kind of an error bar around it. So sometimes when you see estimates of abundance, it might be that single point estimate, but there's also uncertainty around that. And then in that science paper, they tried to take all sets of data, mix it with assumed parameters about the mortality rate and birth rate of gray whales to then come up with a modeled abundance. So you can get kind of abundance coming from a couple of different directions. So that's why you might, even in my charts or in some of the other ones, you'll sometimes see numbers that aren't exactly the same.
That's excellent explanation. Thanks, John. That's
You
the
bet.
only question we have right now.
Okay. Well, the Pacific Coast Feeding Group is that group of gray whales that feeds. Unlike the sounders that kind of move on after the springtime, the Pacific Coast Feeding Group is there through the summer and fall and may not go north at all. And it's a group that Jim Darling first documented in the 1970s off Vancouver Island. We began doing work on these PCFG whales in the early 1980s is when I first started studying them. And that's become an important kind of group to study. We've ended up developing this, what we call a collaborative catalog database that Cascadia manages. We have contributions coming from quite a number of people, including some from in your area as well. We've tried to focus our catalog and database on the PCFG range, which is Northern California to Southeast Alaska, and June to November, which is kind of outside that migration window when the whales that are primarily in that zone would be non-migrating PCFG whales. But we do also get whales from other periods and times. We have, well over 2,000 different unique gray whales in our catalog, some 35,000 records through 2022. And we're using this for a variety of studies. And I don't intend for you to read this other than these are years across the top. And these are some of the major contributors to that catalog, which include Cascadia, but other researchers and the hundreds of photographs some of these groups have contributed over many years to just say that's why we call it a collaborative database and catalog. Okay, sorry. And we try to do these studies up and down the coast, but again, focused on Northern California, up through Southeast Alaska. Up in the Northern California area, the main collaborators, I've done some surveys and try to document gray whales when I'm there, but Don Goley at HSU has done a bunch of them, and Jeff Jacobson has contributed a lot of photos for that Northern California area. And we do use these in a mark recapture model to estimate the abundance of these PCFG gray whales. And unlike the tens of thousands of the overall gray whale population, our estimates of the PCFG gray whales are around 200 animals. So they're not a lot of them. They represent a fairly small group compared to the overall population. But we think they are distinctive. Several studies done both in Canadian waters and in US waters have documented that the mix of haplotypes, genetics in the maternally transferred DNA from mother to offspring, the pattern of mitochondrial DNA is statistically significantly different in PCFG gray whales than in the overall Eastern North Pacific population that feeds in Alaska. That has kind of how different governments have treated that. Canada recognizes the PCFG gray whales as a distinct unit. The IWC recognizes it as a distinct unit, but the US currently does not. It treats it as just a subset of the Eastern North Pacific gray whale population. We've had a few surprising findings that have, I'll just bring up two of them that we brought up in these papers. One is we found that these PCFG gray whales do go down to Mexico to feed the same areas that the overall Eastern North Pacific gray whales are going down to, so they're likely interbreeding with them to some degree. But we were surprised that they seem to remain associated with other PCFG gray whales on migration. So traveling south, even in Southern California, we would find PCFG gray whales, often still associated and traveling with other PCFG gray whales. And that maybe wasn't tremendously surprising, because if they were feeding together, maybe they took off together. But this relationship seemed to also remain in place when they came back northbound. They were again significantly associated with each other versus other whales. So it looks like they either stayed together or reassociated. So there's some interesting affinities of these PCFG gray whales. And also there's a recent paper that came out by Casey Berlick out of OSU, also talking about how the morphometrics, the sizes and girth of these PCFG gray whales looks a little different than the overall Eastern North Pacific population. We've also documented that a lot of the recruitment, the new whales coming in are internal. In other words, mothers, PCFG mothers are giving birth to calves that then they return to the PCFG area with and become the next recruits into the PCFG. Okay, designations. The status of the PCFG whale whales has also been important in some of the debates and discussions around the resumption by the macaw of whaling. This is one of the last photographs from one of the last in the early 1900s whales the macaw took before they stopped their hunt, and gray whales were treated as endangered. Once gray whales were removed from the endangered species list, the macaw proposed resuming their historical hunt. And in 1999, these photographs are from 1999, they did take a juvenile gray whale. And since then, their hunt has been sort of caught up in legal battles and going through an administrative process through both NEPA and an exemption to the Marine Mammal Protection Act. It is likely that we'll see a resumption of macaw whaling after those challenges are exhausted in coming years. Fortunately, even though the U.S. doesn't recognize the PCFG whales as a distinct unit, the macaw management plan that they've worked out with NOAA currently includes consideration of taking PCFG whales. Okay, let's see. We do have an online catalog of just the PCFG gray whales at Cascadia Research PCFG catalog. This is something, and it also has links to what's called the PCFG Consortium, some of the researchers that are involved in this work. I did want to mention just a couple of facts, and then I'll wrap up so I can take questions. We did just come out, 10 days ago, a long overdue paper in Frontiers in Marine Science defining what we called biologically important areas for cetaceans along the US West Coast. This is a follow-up to a paper we did in 2015, and as part of a coordinated effort that NOAA sponsored to do this for kind of US waters, so there are other BIAs designated in Alaskan waters, East Coast, Hawaii, and this is the West Coast paper. And as a part of that, we used a large number of data sets to kind of define biologically important areas for gray whales and revise the earlier work we had done. And that includes migratory BIAs and redefining some of the migratory corridors for gray whales, it also included recognizing some of the feeding areas for gray whales, including the sounders in northern Puget Sound and some of the PCFG feeding areas as well in different areas. You'll see these PCFG feeding areas do not quite extend down to Fort Bragg, just because that's a little less frequently used feeding area for the PCFG gray whales than some of the areas to the north. But we were glad to get this out. This doesn't give them any specific added legal protection, but we were surprised when we did this before in 2015 that these biologically important areas were, then used in any considerations by, agencies or even in legal suits, related to protections to certain areas. I did want to just again remind you that there is this work that was done with the Western gray whales. Here's Sakhalin Island over here. Back in 2011, it was thought these gray whales were a remnant of a Western population that migrated down maybe to off China. But when satellite tags were deployed by Bruce Mate and colleagues at Oregon State University, it turned out that some of these gray whales, this is the track, instead of going south to breeding areas off China, they crossed the Pacific and came south along the US West Coast. And with added data that they did, and this is taken from one of their publications, they were going down to the same eastern North Pacific winter breeding areas off Baja, and in this case, down to Magdalena Bay area. I just have a couple of slides just to point out that entanglements, have gone up. This is the number of large whale entanglements along the US West Coast as documented by NOAA. You can see how recent years we've seen this rise in entanglements. So that's been something we've been more intensely studying and trying to help manage. Gray whales have been a consistent species entangled, but this big increase was largely driven by humpback whales. Were what it increased. Okay, good. I think that is probably a good place to stop and see if I can take some questions.
Well, gosh, thank you so much, John. That was like such a meaty presentation. I wish we could have done it twice as long. I would have liked to have seen all of the slides. So one of my questions still has to do with the unusual mortality event. And are you theorizing as to why we see those spikes when we see it? Is it prey availability? Is it warmer seas? And
yes, you'll notice I kind of ducked.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, you did.
Yeah. And what I call it is an interaction between a growing gray whale population, reaching the limits of the food supply, and then becoming vulnerable to any fluctuations in that food supply. So it's an interaction of both a good thing, gray whales recovering, and this change in gray whale prey that seems to vacillate for not reasons we can completely predict. That's where, to me, the biggest question we've left unanswered is that interaction with climate change, and the warming of the Arctic and the reduction in ice conditions, and sometimes, like there's one area I mentioned in the Chirikov Basin, it's called, where a woman named Jackie Grebmeyer has been studying the prey of gray whales in that area there. And that used to be a very abundant feeding area for gray whales. And the prey densities there have crashed, are much lower, and you get hardly any gray whales feeding there. But what's tricky is a lot of gray whales have shifted north into new areas that they couldn't access before and are feeding up there. So it's hard to just say, oh, prey declined in the Chirikov, that affected the gray whales, because now you have this other factor of, well, now they're able to go to these other areas and feed. And interestingly enough, when you think about prey for gray whales, and this holds for all of the baleen whales, because they're filter feeders, it's almost less about the total mass of prey than it is about the density of prey.
Mhm.
Because as a filter feeder, you can actually have very abundant prey, but if it's dispersed, they can't, in an energy efficient way, filter feed it at a way that is, worth the cost.
Yeah, worth
Doing
the
that.
energetics.
You know,
Yeah.
so there are also subtle things. It's not just how much prey is there, and how is it aggregated, how accessible is it, what's its nutritional content, when can the gray whales access it? So it's a combination of those factors. So I think at this point, like in the Chirikov Basin, when I've asked Jackie, well, has the prey density there declined because the water's warmer and there isn't ice? Well, she'll say, well, that might be a factor, but actually it's because there's stronger currents. And the stronger currents are resulting in larger sediment grain sizes. And that's making that area, less ideal for some of the gray whale prey. And some of those changes in currents could be driven by changes in ice conditions. But
Yeah,
I
wow,
think
fascinating.
I think I'm just telling you why I kind of gave a fairly vague answer, because those dynamics are fairly tricky and I don't think fully resolved.
Well, so to follow with that question, then what would you like to see as like the next step in sort of our data collection to help sort of bring those two things together, like what we're seeing on the climate side
Right.
and these trends that we're seeing in populations?
Well, absolutely. And obviously I'll focus first on what every scientist does, was focus on what they're studying. Uh,
Right.
we, we kind of view the sounders, where we have a group of regularly returning animals, the same individuals, give us this unique view of their body condition and how they're doing each year. And we're also able to look at the energetics of their feeding in a way that has been impossible anywhere else to do. One of the things we've noticed, and when I talk about gray whales adapting to this strategy, is even the whole discovery of the sounders of this ghost shrimp feeding area was kind of showed their adaptability and change. But now, like, we had 4 whales show up this year in December and January that then have foregoed migrating to Mexico and just stayed and fed in the northern Puget Sound area. So they even adapted some of their migratory pattern to take advantage of it. And those huge fluctuations that I showed in numbers of gray whales in the total population, reflecting sometimes a quarter to a third of the animals dying. In the sounders gray whales, the ones that have discovered the supplemental area to feed, we've seen very little mortality. Going all the way back to these whales that discovered it in 1990 and 91, and then in 1999, 2000, of that core group of 12 gray whales, across that 30-year period, we've only had 2 disappear.
Yeah.
So they've weathered that storm remarkably well. So we're seeing some of the strategies gray whales are, are developing. And maybe what I tend to think is the fact that gray whales can do this, that they can explore, discover new feeding techniques, then remember and return to it, may reflect the fact that they've had to deal with this challenge, over hundreds of thousands of years. And so it was in their interest to figure out, how to discover alternate feeding ways and not be locked into only one place and one way to feed. And
Yeah.
it may not let gray whales survive at the large numbers, the 20, 25,000, but it's a reason I'm very hopeful about that they are going to do okay. There'll be at least, a significant portion of the population that will find these ways to make it through these tough periods. I do think, just to answer now the part of your question that doesn't have to do with what I'm doing, we need a lot more work understanding gray whale feeding in the Arctic, the area that is their primary feeding ground. It's a tough area to study. The kind of work that Jackie Grebmeier does, we need that even more. Some of the types of tag deployments we've done to look at feeding, we need to be able to do that in the Arctic and get an understanding of how that relates to the feeding going on up there.
Well, you sort of touched on this conflicting science about whether the melting ice is positive or negative for the whales. And I remember seeing a presentation a number of years ago by somebody who said gray whales are going to be the climate winners because as we lose ice in the Arctic, they're going to go around and their habitat range is going to expand. And we saw the first whale, on the East Coast. What do you have to say about that? Like,
Yes. And there've been a couple of, gray whales do seem to like to wander, and maybe that's part of their adaptability to discover other areas. And even that, so recently there were sightings on the East Coast, but those weren't the first one. There were several gray whale sightings, I want to say 8-10 years ago in the Mediterranean.
yeah,
That was another wandering gray whale. There was a sighting a few years ago in Hawaii. So we don't exactly know what route those whales take, but certainly the loss of ice now makes a route going up over the top much more feasible. And that may be combined with this, when gray whales are not doing well or are facing challenges on their traditional feeding grounds, they seem ready to go in search of better pastures.
great. All right. Well, I've monopolized the questions. And Sarah, I saw you had your hand up for a while. Did you get your question answered, or did you want to ask a question? Sarah's our marine mammal stranding coordinator, so she's got the most experience of all of us in this part of the world.
Oh, great.
Just in this little part. No, thank you so much. And I love the openness to allow understanding to grow and be dynamic in and of itself. But noticing the Pacific group here for 3 years and then not, I thought was pretty interesting that they kind of came down here and were off of Mendocino, McCarraker, those areas, and observed between the remnant kelp beds, which you kind of touched on the concentration, and it looked like they were feeding on mysids,
Yeah.
just in from one remnant kelp bed across the bay to the other one, and back and forth and around these little rocks and things like that. I thought was really interesting. And then they haven't been here for the last couple of years in my anecdotal observations. I also recognized one of the ones that Karen Berelsheimer got a picture of, that Rambelina, I think, and saw that she was one that was here 3 years ago and then hasn't been here since, at least that we've observed. And then one other, just more of a question. I don't know if Teresa Mercer or Scott want to ask it, but Teresa brought up the end of the UME declaration in the lower number stranding, but wanting to reflect the lower number of whales, because we went from the mid-20s to the mid-teens. And so, of course, there's going to be fewer stranding if there's fewer whales.
Yes, no, that's, and I'll respond on a couple of those things. The PCFG whales going further south, I was surprised even a few years before they were in your area. There were 2 years that they were spending a lot of time at Bodega Head, and we had about a dozen PCFG gray whales that far south as well. So it does seem like they'll shift around. Their dominant prey does seem to be the swarms of mysid shrimp on the edge of kelp beds. But we've been surprised to sometimes find them feeding a little more offshore in deeper water. They like the overall gray whales, they seem to have a number of tricks and types of prey to feed on. And there do seem to be other groups, including some of the PCFG gray whales, that feed heavily on some of the herring spawn, especially on Vancouver Island and Southeast Alaska. So they're capable of feeding on that as well. So they do have a variety of prey that they'll go after, which is kind of exciting to see them adapt and deal with that. Let's see, your second, I'm trying to remember your other point that you raised, that was your question was.
Lower numbers of stranding,
Yes.
reflecting lower number of
Yes.
whales.
And it's one of the reasons, like when the NOAA, the group that advises NOAA on UMEs, when we were first evaluating, both the strandings as they first occurred and when they occurred later, we computed all of those as a percent of population, because we wanted to correct for that. Okay, yes, we've got this, uptick in strandings in 2019, but is that just because there are more gray whales? And we could see that even as a proportion, it was higher. And obviously that would now drop as a proportion as well. So there were a couple of other indicators that were suggesting gray whales were coming out of this UME, but the stranding numbers can be tricky for that reason, and you do have to factor in that abundance. So that's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. We're just so honored to have you
It's fun to
speak
talk to
to
you
us.
guys.
All right, we're going to kick it over to another one of our NOAA Center team members, Sue, who's one of our educators. She has her hand up.
Sorry. Thank you so much, John, for your decades of incredible work that you've been doing. I can't imagine where we'd be if we didn't have you tracking all that you've tracked over the years and comparisons to make and all that. So really grateful to your dedication and your work. I'm curious what you might advise, being somebody who works with children and interacts with visitors and tourists and stuff. What do you think is an important message around where the gray whales are at to share? Like, because it's really easy to overshare. And I like that you brought up that it's not super black and white as far as like environmental factors and the UME and all that. So I just was curious if you had, a suggestion of how to, share.
Well, as I'm sure you're aware and do, the big thing I try to do, even when I'm talking about whales to, kids and, the general public, is to draw, at least keep making that connection between whales and the health of the marine environment and the conditions in the ocean. And even if the gray whale UME isn't a simple, concept relationship we can get across, we can still get that general overall concept across, that these whales are largely driven by their prey availability and the health of the oceans. And it's really important to take care of that. If you love whales, you need to love the environment and protect it from the types of dramatic changes that are going to alter. And as was pointed out, gray whales may sometimes, come out ahead on some things related to climate change, but overall, these types of rapid changes, are going to, have consequences for species that can't quite adapt as quickly as that. So that's kind of one of the
Beautiful
main things I like to do. So
thank you. I appreciate that.
I just see that Megan Stevens asked a question about the drone tag deployment.
Oh.
Sounds like it's an exciting advancement in technology. Is there a big price difference or anything else preventing us from using that method more widely in the future?
Thank you, Sarah.
yes, no, that's a good point. I would just say that it's certainly the direction we're going to go. And so there is quite a rapid, embracing of that as a potentially, lower impact way to deploy tags on animals. There's some added, expense, in doing drone deployments, but, it pays off just with the fact you can get deployments more efficiently out. So I don't think that's any kind of a hurdle. The thing I was impressed by, and that I'll just, put some praise on the Ocean Alliance folks, is Chris Zarda, the UAS pilot that we worked with, was, I've worked with a lot of drone pilots and we've used drones in a number of studies over time, but he showed a level of skill and precision that I had not seen before that really aided things. And he had some challenges. For example, the tags we're deploying, because they have, flotation and cameras and these other things, they're a little bit bigger. Some of the smaller tags you can use like something like a lawn dart to keep them oriented properly as they fall, but our tags, we couldn't quite do that. So he quickly discovered that, if there was any side motion or crosswind or any control adjustments he was making, the tag would start to gain a little bit of rotation and wouldn't land flat on the whale. And so just to see them both kind of set up for that maneuver, get in the right position, and then do it in a way they could then predict that without adjusting any control, he could have, the tag drop very cleanly straight down without any side motion on it. So anyway, so that's maybe the other hurdle. I would say right now there's a little bit of technology. It has to be a little bit of a larger drone that can carry the weight of the tag. And then, it took us a little bit to get our permits modified to allow drone deployments. I had aerial surveys and that I then allowed to be UAS overflights. I had tag deployments with poles, but I didn't have tags dropped from drone. So I had to go through a permit modification to get that and allow that. So those are more the hurdles, kind of skill, equipment, and permitting to get that in place. But I'd say it's happening pretty quickly, given how recently this was pioneered within the last 2 years.
Yeah, that was stunning to see that the scale of drop. I was shocked that the tag was dropped onto the whale. That was amazing. But there's a lot of regulations around drones and marine mammals. Are you seeing, like, when you're deploying these tags, are you seeing any changes in behavior or anything like that?
Some, yes. And it is sort of a little bit of a sore spot, if you will, I think with NOAA, especially because there's a huge amount of, non-permitted,
Yeah, right.
recreational drone flights, even used by many whale watch companies. I've never gotten worked up about it because it did seem like it was certainly less disturbing than close boat approaches, and certainly puts whales at less risk than a boat strike might do it by trying to get close to a whale. So it has not been kind of a worrisome thing. We will not fly these larger drones we have because they are drones that, are bigger and could injure a person, and they're worth, $20,000-$30,000 if there's another drone in the air. So, sometimes we don't welcome if there are other people trying to fly at the same time we are, because that'll ground our operations. But other than that, I have not viewed it as a huge issue, and it's just taken NOAA a little while to kind of sort out how they want to regulate that, and also, see that applied in any consistent way across the landscape of recreational whale watch and research users.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly it's less invasive than the method that you showed. It was really cool that you showed both methods, but yeah, that's what the context is, the recreational use. And I mean, it's beautiful. The kind of footage we can get now is so beautiful from drones.
It
I mean,
is.
there's real advantage to some of that, but yeah, it's a curious question. All right, I see we have a question from Wendy. She's part of the Science Talk team and was responsible for helping get you here tonight. So thank you, Wendy and Peggy, for that.
Yes.
And also a NOYO Center board member. So Wendy, go ahead.
All right. No pressure there. I actually have two questions. One is, if you're using drones, are you still able to get the biopsies that you were before when you were doing it, from a boat? And then my other question is, I was surprised to see all the strandings down in the Baja area. So are those animals dying for different reasons than the ones who have migrated further north and all the stresses with that migration?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Start with the biopsy question. Currently, we're still collecting biopsies, with the Crossbow. I know there have been people working on experiments to try to add that to the drone drop, or, look at some way that could be done by drone, but by its very nature of needing to make contact and collect tissue, that's probably going to be kind of more invasive and not the total answer, if you will, to a non-invasive way of getting skin sampling. For a while, people were excited, and I want to say this was more like 20 years ago. We did a lot of collections of slough skin from whales. And we weren't getting the same kind of adequate genetic materials we are. There is now a new wave of work, they call it eDNA, environmental DNA, of now trying to develop new genetic techniques that are better at, getting data from very low concentrations of DNA in the water column. So there may be some new directions like that will kind of be helpful, to reduce that impact. I'm not too concerned about it in the sense that, we've studied these gray whales and other species for many years and collected samples, and the responses we see to a biopsy dart seem to be either none or very short-lived. We'll actually typically get a stronger response if we take a dart shot and we miss the whale, just because the dart will make contact with the water near the whale, and it looks like it will startle the whale, like there was something there that I didn't realize was there, and will actually get a weaker response sometimes from an actual hit. So anyway, so those are the directions with the biopsy part that that you mentioned. So we'll see where that goes right now, but for now we're using mostly dart deployments. Okay, and your second question was on
Mortalities in Baja.
mortalities in Baja, yes. And I know less about those that are down there. I know they often deteriorate due to the heat pretty quickly, and and there's only a small portion of those that get detailed exams. But pretty much when you look at the seasonality of the sightings of the strandings, they sort of start in December, January, and then generally pick up into the spring. And that very much sort of matches as you think about, okay, there's an interaction here probably of as you get into December and January, you're starting to get into the gray whale fast. So whales that maybe haven't quite gotten enough nutritional, of a reserve are starting to hit the limits of that. Some of that may be logistical, because then as they migrate north, they're migrating through waters that where we're more likely to find the carcasses. Probably the areas where we have the lowest rate of successful carcass recovery probably are up in the feeding areas. Many of these whales, especially if they're emaciated and dying in, say, May or June, they will sink. The less blubber and less oil the gray whale has, the more likely it is to be negatively buoyant. And depending on how deep the water is where it sinks, will dictate whether the decomposition of the whale and production of gases will be enough to counter the water pressure and bring it to the surface. But I'm sure there's probably larger numbers of whales dying in Alaska than are documented too. And we haven't had a good way to really measure that, but I'm sure there's, some differences in that. Whales that would die in some of the breeding lagoons in Baja would probably be the easiest to find, because those are confined, shallow waters. So didn't quite answer your question, but some of the thinking on
That was good.
stranding.
Thank you.
Okay. I do see a question about other feeding strategies
Exactly, yep.
in the chat. I'll point out that at least the PCFG gray whales, do seem to have, we sometimes see them feeding on the bottom. We see them feeding in kelp beds. We see them feeding on these swarms of mysid shrimp. There are a couple of papers, I think one's in press, from some of the tags we deployed on PCFG gray whales off Oregon. And there's a paper describing, these headstands that the gray whales do to feed in some of the areas off Oregon where they feed. The feeding, sometimes seeing whales skim feed with a mouth part open at the surface. I've had gray whales in amongst humpbacks feeding on swarms of krill. They have just a few throat pleats on their throat, so they are able to distend their throat and engulf water a little bit more. So that's some of the variety of prey that they have. I know Guy Oliver, who used to study gray whale feed, would describe that gray whales would feed on Dungeness crab. And I forget what evidence he had from where he dived, where he thought he'd see these scrape marks where the whales were pulling crab off the bottom. I don't know. There's many prey types. I think as we deploy more of these tags, we'll see more of these strategies. Some of these gray whales we've had feeding a little bit offshore of Oregon and Washington have been a little bit of a mystery to me what they're feeding on down there, and we don't have an idea. But there are a half dozen or more papers on kind of prey of gray whales that have been looked at. Research coming by Jim Darling and by University of Victoria researchers looking at that, and now coming out of OSU. Lee Torres at Oregon State University has what's rapidly grown as research program focused on PCFG gray whales, and there's a lot of work coming out of there as well on that.
Super. Well, with that, we're at our hour and a half mark, and I think it's time for everybody to go have some dinner. Again, John, many, many, many thanks for sharing all of your brilliance and expertise with us for the last hour and a half. It's been really, really a joy to listen to all the work you've done, and I echo Sue's thanks for all that you've put into the world of marine mammals over the decades. I hope we get you back again soon, because this has just been so informative, and maybe we could talk about blue whales next time, because we always want to do that around here.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And I'll look forward to visiting the Noyo Center. I'll hope to be, down in that area, maybe in August or September of this year. Southwest Fisheries Science Center will be doing a systematic ship survey along the entire West Coast, and we'll be trying to shadow portions of their survey doing our small boat work, and it hopefully will get us out in August or September out of Fort Bragg again.
That's great to hear, and you have a standing invitation to come visit us anytime. Let us know, and we will give you a
Right.
tour and show you what we're up to. But thank you, everybody who's joined us tonight. And again, if you feel like donating, we much appreciate it, and support either us as a nonprofit or any of your favorite nonprofits, John's, for instance. So it's great to support these groups that are doing so much amazing work.